When should we listen to anger? Ireland, the country where I grew up, was one of the first countries that Nelson Mandela visited when he was released from prison in 1990. And I can remember vividly to this day going into the city centre of Dublin to listen to this incredible statesman delivering a speech to tens of thousands of people in the centre of Dublin. From that day, I have two abiding memories. The first is that political dreams can be realized. I had never really believed that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison, let alone that apartheid would end. And yet there I was in the centre of Dublin, listening to this amazing man delivering an extraordinary speech. The second abiding memory I have from that day is of a very different sort. Whilst I was listening to Mandela, in the corner of my eye, I was consistently distracted by this angry man. There was a man waving an Irish flag, and eventually I looked at him and he stared at me and he said, angrily, shouting, "What about our own oppressed people? What about the people of Ireland?" And I remember, even as a teenager, being struck by this comment and thinking to myself, the whole point of today is that it's not about us. Now that image of that angry Irish man, that angry nationalist waving his flag, has come back to me time and again. 25 years later, I was in Miami, Florida, on a business trip. And I was sitting in a taxi in heavy traffic. And I started conversation with the cab driver. The cab driver happened to be an Irish American. He'd moved from Boston, he'd retired to Florida, and he was now working as a cab driver. I struck up a conversation with him, and he told me about his daughter. His daughter suffered from a very, very rare heart condition. And after repeated visits to hospital and to medical practitioners, they were advised that the only specialist who could cure her was a world-renowned heart surgeon based with the Miami Dolphins football team. So eventually, they sought his help, and his daughter was cured of her heart condition. But there was a catch. He was saddled with over $1 million in debt. Now, this incredibly mild-mannered and kind man, as the conversation developed, he started to visibly change. At that time, this was 2009, just after the financial crisis in America, he was hearing stories of bankers getting bonuses of millions of dollars, despite the fact that the companies that they'd worked for had actually failed. As far as he could tell, these people were lucky to have escaped jail, let alone be getting £1 million bonuses. And slowly, this mild-mannered, calm man started to get visibly angry. This was not what he expected to be happening in America. This was not fair. He'd paid his taxes. As far as he was concerned, he'd been a good father. He'd been a good husband. And these people had cheated. And Americans were being cheated. Now, this was a very, very different sort of anger. So the first question I want to pose to you is, are all angers equivalent? Now, subsequently, I started doing research into the subject of anger. And I used a system. IBM has this system called Watson Analytics. It's a big data system, and it allows you to search hundreds of thousands of news stories. So I did a search under the category of anger of thousands of news stories. And two very interesting results came from this process. The first, which I think the cab driver in Miami epitomizes, is what we might think of as moral outrage, which is a sense that a great unfairness or injustice has been done. I like to call this the anger of angels. Now, the anger of angels is very interesting Because if you look in moral philosophy, the Greek philosopher Aristotle actually identified something very similar to this idea. Aristotle interpreted anger not as an irrational emotion, but actually as an appropriate response to a sense of injustice. And I was reminded precisely of this Aristotelian idea when I heard Cornel West speaking on CNN. Some of you may remember, Cornel West gave a speech effectively on CNN, which went viral during the BLM protests. And he made a very, very profound point. What he said was, what would it say about our society if we witnessed police brutality on our screens and it didn't make us angry and it didn't cause us to protest? Now, that Aristotelian idea that he was articulating so powerfully reveals that anger, or specifically the anger of angels, is in fact our moral compass. Now, the second type of anger that came from the big data search was again very, very different and is both surprising and obvious. The second most frequent type of story this big data search produced involving anger related to angry sports fans. Now, immediately you're probably thinking, particularly if you go to a football match, did he really need to do a data search? And that's a very fair point. But there's a fascinating question that's raised by this observation, which is, why is it that men, and it's typically men, actually pay money to go and watch football, very often second-rate games of football, very often in inclement weather, in order to get angry? So, why is it that we have this tribal rage, this angry sports fan? And I suddenly realized when I'd done this research that that was the flag-waving nationalist. And that, in fact, is the anger of devils. So, we have two types of anger. We have the anger of angels, which is our moral compass, and we have the anger of devils, which is a rage that enforces tribal identity, that sets us against each other. So, which should we listen to? Well, on the face of it, it seems obvious that we should listen to the anger of angels. They give us moral guidance. The problem is, the devil is very clever and doesn't always come with an angry face. In fact, if you look at the research in social psychology, our propensity to form groups based on trivial distinctions is always latent in human interaction. Whether it's left wing, whether it's right wing, whether it's yellow shirts, blue shirts, red shirts, liberals, conservatives, the pull of tribal identity is so strong, it's very, very difficult to resist. And it's often too subtle to even perceive. Now, our politicians are precisely trying to exploit those instincts. Research in political science shows that angry people are more likely to vote. It is also the case that elections are increasingly being won by very, very slim majorities. So if we take, for example, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 as American president, he actually only won by changing the voting behavior of 80,000 Americans. That's a fraction of 1%. So if you think of it like this, politicians are incentivized to get elected. Political elections are being won by very, very slim majorities, and angry people are more likely to vote. There's a very clear result, which is our tribal instincts will be exploited by the political class. So the question I posed at the outset, when should we listen to anger, is right now. We need to listen to all of these angers because what they reveal is that there is a fundamental void in our politics. And this is why I became an economist. The void at the heart of our politics today is the absence of truly radical and transformative economic ideas that can motivate idealists and can re-engage us with politics driven by the anger of angels. If I listen to the anger of angels today, I hear three distinct voices. The first one is that environmental degradation is intolerable. The second one is that the extremes of wealth and income inequality in our society are no longer acceptable. And the third one is that we cannot tolerate the fact that the weakest in our society are the ones that are most vulnerable to austerity, economic downturns, or recessions. Now, we have a blueprint. We can set up national endowments to give assets to the people in our society who don't have any. We can create a global Green New Deal to transform the future of our global economy and make it sustainable. And we can transform our monetary and fiscal authorities to protect the weakest in our society. So we face a fork in the road. Either we allow tribal rage to dominate our politics, and the logical result of that will be violence, or we have the bravery and courage to respond to the anger of angels and create new economic institutions that will genuinely transform our daily lives. If we do this, anger can become a distant noise. Thank you.